Let's recap the Seahawks draft and figure out what grade Trevor Sikkema of Pro Football Focus is going to give it. He joins us now on the Emerald Queen Casino Sportsbook Hotline. Trevor, how's it going?
It's going great. Appreciate you guys having me.
We are happy to have you on. We have so much to talk to you about, and we'll probably ask you a few questions about some other draft classes outside of Seattle. Before we get to it, though, you gave the Seahawks a B+. Now, B's and C's get degrees, so you will not find me arguing with that. But why not an A, and why better than a C? Why specifically a B+?
No, I think it's a B+ because they drafted what they wanted to draft. There were a couple of positions where, okay, you're drafting guys a little bit higher than where I have them valued on my big board. You know, A.J. Barner, I can understand exactly why they drafted him, right? You've got, receiving tight ends on the team right now. You want to get more of a blocking tight end there, but he's a lot higher of where they picked him, the relative pick selection versus where he was on my big board. The same thing with Nehemiah Pritchett. But yeah, it's just overall, they took a lot of guys that were higher in their picks than where I had them on my big board. But really what you want to focus on the most for Seattle are those two those two selections that they had, Byron Murphy II and then Christian Haynes. I absolutely love both of these picks from them. So it's hard for me to really, a B+ honestly is nitpicking a little bit from the Seahawks, and it's more of just based off of where I had these guys ranked on my big board. But ultimately those first two picks, that's what you highlight the most with Seattle's draft. They needed those two types of players, and they got both of them.
Trevor, when I prepare for the draft, I go about 120 deep to where I'm grinding film, right? I'm looking at all this stuff. Then after that, I glance because I go, well, these are going to be fit type of guys. What fits their system and what they're trying to accomplish. When you look at the Seahawks draft, what looks like the biggest reach? You mentioned, right, focus on the first two picks, number 16 and 81, Murphy and Haynes. But after that, did you feel like, all right, that was a complete reach, and they must see something I don't see?
Yeah, it's nothing that's too glaring. Again, I bring up Barner because Barner was ranked in the 200s, the early 200s on my big board, just because he's a very, to me, streamlined blocking type of tight end, which doesn't make him bad at his job or not valuable. I want to make that very clear. But you get a lot of those guys every single year, so the uniqueness of what he brings to the table, it's something that's kind of replaceable every single year. So I had him much lower on my board versus where they pick him at 121. But again, like I said at the very top, I know why they did it. So it's hard for me to look at it and say, yeah, okay, I could have waited here. With Barner, I feel like there's a good chance they could have got him in the 5th round, like where they picked Nehemiah Pritchett, maybe even the 6th round where they picked Lumea. But I understand what they're going for. Pritchett's kind of the same way. He's a little bit lower on my big board than where the Seahawks ended up drafting him. But corner is often one of those positions, kind of where you have a type, where you interview the guy, you see how he ticks. It's a very interesting position because you have to be unbelievably confident, almost to a fault, to play that position. They know that very well with Devon Witherspoon, who was one of my favorite prospects in the draft last year, and they've already seen good returns on that. So maybe, you interview him, you get to know this player, and he ticks, if you will, the way that you want him to in between the ears, and I think that could have been the case with Pritchett. So those are the two selections that are the biggest discrepancy or gap between where they were picked and my big board, but it is defensible with both of them because I see where they're streamlined for what the Seahawks want to do with them.
Trevor, let's go back to pick number 16. Seattle had a choice of someone like Troy Fautanu, which would be filling a giant hole on the roster where there was no depth, or adding to a position that already had some depth, but maybe not that kind of top-level elite talent. They opted to improve a position where they already had some guys. It's almost like a philosophical approach, right? Like you could look at it as, well, I want to be really, really elite here versus just kind of getting a starter here. What did you make of the approach they took in getting Murphy where they already had some defensive linemen?
Yeah, I didn't mind it at all, especially for the talent that Byron Murphy is. I had Jerzon Newton from Illinois, the interior defensive lineman, ranked ahead of Byron Murphy, but they were both right there, and they were both top 15 players on my board. So to get him, where they did at number 16, that's kind of that BPA approach that people talk about all the time. And the reason why, yes, if you're looking at it from a pure needs perspective, you mentioned the bigger need was technically along the offensive line. I thought they would have gone with Troy Fautanu, but I can't hate what they did here because you're getting a really good player who's going to be a difference maker for you. Byron Murphy, I expect to be a mainstay on this defensive line for years. And so it's really hard to argue that pick just because of need. And in fact, I think the draft is normally operated well when you go more towards best player available than need. I think it's a balance of both, but I think anybody out there would tell you you can't pass up on these good players just because you may have had a need here and there. You often draft for much longer than just the 2024 season, right? I think we all get caught up in, oh, okay, well, look at their depth chart for 2024. This is what they need the most. But in reality, you should be signing free agents for the current year. You should be drafting for the years that follow. So I have no problem with what they did there, especially when you look at how this draft was constructed, really, and the depth of it. And there was going to be a good interior offensive lineman. Now, I didn't think that Christian Haynes, one of my favorite players in the draft, was going to get to them at number 81, but there was going to be somebody along the interior offensive line who they knew they could pick in the third round. Whereas if you flip it, you go Fautanu at the first round, not really a lot of interior defensive linemen who could be anything close to the impact that Byron Murphy could have. So to me, the bigger need along the interior offensive line, no doubt about it, but to get Murphy where they did and then to get Haynes was evidence of a really good draft strategy and really good prep work before draft weekend.
Trevor, I'm with you in the sense that all their picks made sense. There was a pick that wasn't made that surprised me. It was them not drafting a running back. The Seattle Seahawks are known for drafting RBs, right? They want to keep 3 or 4 in the stable at all times. So they didn't draft a running back, but they did draft 2 corners. What does that say about this roster? Is there someone on this roster you feel like, all right, the Hawks aren't completely sold on it, and they want to make sure at the corner position they're good to go?
Well, obviously you have an incredible rookie season from Breek Woolen, and I still think is a really talented player. But, cornerback I just think is a very up and down position. So you want to be able to have the bodies to supplement if somebody is, having a down year. Shoot, I mean, we were even talking about this not too long ago, a couple of buddies of mine, just A.J. Terrell from the Atlanta Falcons, right? A.J. Terrell, okay, he has that all-pro season. Then the next year, it's like he was barely even startable. Now he kind of bounced back a little bit, which is fine, but that's just a cornerback position. So I totally understand wanting to throw a lot of resources and draft capital and guys that could really develop to potentially be full-time starters or even spot starters for you just because the position itself is so cyclical. You don't know who's going to have a hot year, and to have these corners that year in and year out you could depend on is so rare. So both Pritchett and DJ James, a lot of experience playing in the SEC. They went up against some really great competition over the last couple of years. These are 2 really talented football players. And so even if they're just depth players for you, I think that they're really high priority depth players of guys that might be able to develop into starters. And then just kind of going back to the earlier part of your question, the running back room, I mean, you got Kenneth Walker and you got Zach Charbonnet, who I think you are very happy with. Then, of course, you got Kenny McIntosh is after them on the depth chart, and I can understand why that they would see the corners that were left on the board where they kind of picked James and Pritchett and said, okay, this is where the worthwhile talent is, right? It goes back to the BPA. It goes back to, well, we haven't drafted a running back yet, but we really like this corner, and just making your team better. And like I said, the draft is much less of a short-term view than I think a lot of people make it out to be. And this is more of, okay, we just think these players are really talented and could be starters for us one day if, contracts go awry or if some guy ends up pricing himself out of where we could bring him back or anything like that. So corner is always a position that you want to be deep at. So I'll never fault somebody too much for loading up at that position.